Okay, this is our Chapter 10 video for project management, in which we are going to be looking at budgeting a project. Now, there is, we could spend an entire semester talking about estimating a project and developing a budget for a project. But this is just one small part of the overall project management process. So this is going to be sort of a high-level overview of budgets and managing budgets and why they're important. So the first thing to talk about here is what's called a plan cost management. So essentially you have to have a plan for the budget. You need, of course, an estimate that will give you an idea of what the project should cost. And then as the project is executed, you need to be constantly comparing the costs compared to what they were originally estimated to be. This is a way of monitoring the progress of the project and making sure things are going as planned, and can alert the project manager to any potential problems that might be occurring. So the management plan is a changing document that, as I said, you want to be comparing the original estimate to how things are actually panning out, and then that might make or at least help you to make some decisions. If you, for instance, are going through your budget too quickly, then you might need to look at some cost savings further down in the project so that in the end you don't run over budget. So as I said, why is it important to manage the cost management plan, or what is the purpose of it? It's really important. I'd say budget and schedule are the two most important things in a project. You want to make sure that you're getting stuff done on time and that you don't go over budget. And so monitoring the cost throughout a project is important. So by managing the budget, you can let stakeholders know, especially the stakeholders who are the source of money for a project. They're probably going to be the most interested in knowing that the project is developing under budget and on time. So it's just basically a good way of tracking progress. So the cost estimate, as I said, I've taught an entire class, a semester-long class on estimating. You need to be familiar with the type of project to know how much things cost. There are published standards if you're not familiar with it, if you don't have first-hand experience in doing that type of project, at least in the construction industry. There are things like RS means. These are publications where you can look up the amount of labor and the cost associated with certain tasks. Mechanics, if you take your car to a shop, they use a similar thing. They can look up how much it costs to change an alternator or whatever the thing may be. Really, the best way of estimating cost is from your own previous personal experience. So if you're a company that has done this type of thing many times before, that's the surest way of knowing how much something will cost. You want to be honest about cost. You don't want to be overly optimistic or set yourself up in a situation where you set a goal that you're not going to be able to meet. You need to be honest with yourself, and of course you need to be honest with the customer about how much something is going to cost. There are a variety of different costs, different ways of categorizing cost: fixed versus variable, direct versus indirect, recurring versus non-recurring, and so on. We're going to look at several of these particular types of costs in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. So we have direct versus indirect costs. So direct costs are costs that occur specifically because of the project. So the materials needed for a project, the labor required for a project, subcontractors, all the things that are used directly to develop or complete the project are considered direct costs. Indirect costs are costs that you would probably have to pay whether or not you were performing the project or not. So if you are a company that has salaried employees, you're going to pay them their salary every 2 weeks or every week or whatever your payment schedule is, regardless of whether or not they're working on a particular project. If you might have to pay rent or utilities on the building in which your business exists. These are all things that you're going to have to pay regardless of whether or not you're working on a particular project. So indirect costs are not directly associated with a specific project, but they are still costs that need to be paid. Recurring versus non-recurring costs are another way to separate and look at different types of costs. So recurring costs are going to continue to repeat themselves throughout a project. So the cost, the labor that you would pay for your masons to lay bricks, as long as they're laying bricks, you're going to have to be paying them. And so that's going to continue throughout the entire project. So as long as work is being done, you will have to pay. When that work is complete, then the payment is complete. Non-recurring costs are typically associated with things at the beginning and ending of a project. So the design and development, you might pay a special consultant to design something early in the design phase of a project, and then they submit their designs, and then they're pretty well done. You can pay them, and their involvement in the project has come to an end. You don't need to continue to pay them throughout the project. And the same thing happens at closing. There are some one-time costs that might be required to be paid at the end. Maybe some fees for certifications or licenses or things like that associated with the closure of a project. So those would be examples of non-recurring costs. Regular versus expedited costs. You should all probably be familiar with this if you've ever ordered something online. If you're willing to be patient and wait for 2-week shipping, it's much cheaper. And so if you plan ahead and know what you're going to need and order it in plenty of time, you can oftentimes save yourself some cost. But when you realize that you need something the very next day and you need it expedited, then you're going to have to pay extra for that. You're going to have to pay for overtime or overnight shipping or other types of costs associated with making things happen more quickly. So usually, whenever possible, you want to avoid incurring expedited costs. It's much better to plan things out in advance, purchase things in a timely manner so that you don't have to pay any extra fees associated with expedition. Now, when you come up with your estimate for a project, chances are something is going to go wrong. Something is not going to go according to plan. And you don't want to be caught off guard by that. You want to make sure that you have some funds in reserve to cover any potentially unforeseen costs. So there are two types of reserves, money that's held back. There's the management reserve, and this is used for unknown possible costs. So it's just sort of a wild card. We want to hold some money back to be able to pay for something we don't know what it will be, but if something unexpected occurs, we want to be able to cover it. The other type is a contingency reserve. This is money that's set aside for risks that we are a little bit more familiar with, something that we can expect, something that perhaps has happened before, will happen again. So it's just essentially a little bit more specific in its purpose. We can anticipate certain risks and plan for them accordingly. So I've already alluded to some of these estimating methods before. There are three primary types, and we'll go into these in a little bit more detail in the following slides. The first is analogous estimating. So basically, like I said, this comes from personal experience. If you are a general contractor and you build houses, you know what goes into building that house. And so when you're asked to work up an estimate to build a new house, you can base it on your previous work, what you've done before. And the more experience you gain, the more accurate your estimates can be. So these types of estimates work best for projects that are very similar to work that's been done before. So if this was some sort of a new research and development project, you probably wouldn't have the basis for comparing it to a previous project if it's something entirely new. So it works best with projects that are not too out of the ordinary, things that you've done before, and so you know the risks associated with it, you know how to avoid them, you know what you're best at, you know how to do things efficiently, and hopefully have kept good records, and that allows you to make a good estimate for the upcoming project. The second type of estimating is parametric estimating. So this is essentially based on some known unit, maybe in cubic yards of concrete or square feet of cladding or lines of code. So it's essentially taking some sort of a rate, like if you know it's going to take a certain number of man hours to pour a concrete foundation per cubic yard, then you can just calculate the number of cubic yards of concrete you need and multiply it by that rate to get your number of labor hours, and then multiply that by the labor rate to find a dollar amount. So it's essentially just taking some known rate and applying it to the quantity that you are going to have to perform to complete the project. So this is a little less accurate than the analogous estimating. It doesn't really take into consideration any type of special conditions or anything unusual or out of the ordinary. Like I said before, there are places where you can look these things up in publications, but your own personal experience and records are going to be the best source of information here. And then a bottom-up estimating is essentially a very detailed method of going through a project, starting at the smallest, simplest activities and working your way up to the completed project. So a bottom-up estimating is a good way of working your way through the entire project. It's a bit more time-consuming, but it really is what gives you the best, most accurate estimate in the end. So looks like I'm coming up close to my 15-minute limit, so I'm going to stop right here, and I'll resume this lecture in the next video.